Hello scholars, in this video we're going to talk about the writing prompt that you have to do on the Mayflower Compact and how you have to explain that the Mayflower Compact is a social contract. Alright, so that's what you've got to do, is you've got to explain why the Mayflower Compact is a social contract. And if you've looked at the assignment, you know that you need to talk about these things in your video. First, you should define what a social contract is. What is a social contract? Then you need to talk about, who were the Pilgrims? Who were they? Why did they come to the New World? Why did they need a social contract? And then next, you need to talk about when was the Mayflower Compact written? And finally, you're going to want to talk about why was the Mayflower Compact a social contract? All right, so notice that we're talking about who, what, when, and why, these kinds of WH questions, and these are pretty typical questions that we use when we're studying history. And in this particular assignment, there's really just 4 of these questions, and let's go over them one more time. First, what is a social contract? Then who? Who were the Pilgrims? And as we're talking about the Pilgrims, you'll talk a little bit about why. Why did they come to the New World? And why did they need a social contract? When was the Mayflower Compact written? And then finally, why? Why is the Mayflower Compact a social contract? All right, let's look at each of these questions and discuss them. First, what is a social contract? Well, a social contract is an agreement among a group of people to create a government and to obey it. Let's go back to that. This is just your definition. So you need to say something like this when you give your talk. You just need to explain what is a social contract. And again, it's an agreement to make a government. All right, then we're going to talk about who were the Pilgrims. Why did they come to the New World? Why did they need a social contract? So now you're going to talk a little bit more, give a few more details here. You're going to talk about how the Pilgrims were a group of Christians in England. Specifically, they were sometimes called separatists or Puritans. They disagreed with the Church of England, and they came to America to start a Christian community. If you want to give more details, that's great. But tell us about, who were the Pilgrims and why did they come to America? And then, why did they need a social contract? Well, when they first arrived in America, they landed far north of the Virginia colony where they were supposed to be, and they were in a wilderness with no government. And they knew that a government was needed. And as we know, the 2 main purposes of government are for security or protection, and secondly, for organization. And that's exactly what they said in their contract. They said, we need this for our better ordering and for our security. So they needed a social contract, again, because they were in a place with no government, what we would call a state of nature, a place with no rules, no government. That could be dangerous, so they needed to stick together and cooperate and make a government. All right, so when? This is easy. When was the Mayflower Compact? It was in 1620. The Mayflower Compact was written in 1620 when the Pilgrims first arrived in the New World. In fact, they wrote the Mayflower Compact before they even got off of the boat. Before they came ashore on land, they agreed to make the Mayflower Compact. They agreed to make a government. And why? Well, we've kind of talked about this a little bit. The Mayflower Compact, or why is the Mayflower Compact a social contract? Well, when you get to this point in your talk, be sure that you make it very plain. The Mayflower Compact is a social contract because it was an agreement made by the Pilgrims to create a new government for their colony in America. Now, notice that we're putting the definition of social contract here. The Mayflower Compact is a social contract. What's a social contract? It's an agreement made by people to make a government. That's what the Mayflower Compact was. It was an agreement made by the Pilgrims to make a government. So, the Mayflower Compact is a social contract. Very simple. All right, so there's our 4 questions again, and when you give your talk, you will see these questions on the board. I'm sorry, these aren't the questions, but here's the whole talk. Let's go over it a little bit here. A social contract is an agreement among a group of people to create a government and to obey it. The Pilgrims were a group of Christians in England. They disagreed with the Church of England, and they came to America to start a Christian community. When the Pilgrims first arrived in America, they landed far north of the Virginia colony. They were in the wilderness with no government. They knew that a government was needed for their protection and organization, so they needed a social contract to make a government. The Mayflower Compact was written in 1620 when the Pilgrims first arrived in the New World, and the Mayflower Compact is a social contract because it was an agreement made by the Pilgrims to create a new government for their colony in America. All right, so this would be an example of giving the talk, but of course, when you do the speaking assignment, you're going to see these things on the board. You'll see these questions, this square right here, you'll see that on the board, and you'll be able to use those prompts to remind you of what you need to talk about. And that's all you need to do to talk about why the Mayflower Compact is a social contract. Good luck.